Senator Plett.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to continue along with the response from the speech from the throne. I'm sure there are many of you now that wish we still had the 2-hour supper break that we used to have instead of only 1 hour. But nevertheless, I want to speak a little bit, and as I said the last time, I'm not doing it for the benefit of the people in the Senate. I'm doing it for the benefit of the 750,000 people who viewed one of my recent speeches when I talked about the failures of this government. I am doing this on behalf of the thousands that have asked me to continue with this. I am making this speech on behalf of my chiropractor, Dr. Chenye, who just this week, Monday, asked, "When are you speaking again?" I look forward to hearing from you. Today, I want to speak about the failed experiments of the woke sorcerer's apprentice. So, as I said, I'm rising to continue my response to the speech from the throne, focusing on Justin Trudeau's legacies. As many of my honourable colleagues know, maybe don't, the German poem of 1797, written by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Der Zauberlehrling, or in English, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, told the tale of an old sorcerer departing his workshop, leaving his apprentice with chores to perform. Tired of fetching water by the pail, the apprentice enchants a broom to do the work for him, using magic in which he is not fully trained. The floor is soon awash with water, and the apprentice realizes that he cannot stop the broom because he does not know the magic required to do so. The apprentice then splits the broom in two with an axe. But now each of the two pieces become a broom of their own, taking up pails and continuing to fetch water, now at twice the speed. At this increased pace, the entire room quickly begins to flood. When all seems lost, the old sorcerer returns and quickly breaks the spell. The poem concludes with the old sorcerer's statement that only a master should invoke powerful spirits. In the poem, the sorcerer's apprentice uses magic to lighten his workload, but because his knowledge and understanding are limited, his spell creates more problems than it solves. The poem illustrated the dangers of power over wisdom and the risk of human creations getting out of control. Likewise, colleagues, I argue Justin Trudeau, with all the power and none of the required wisdom, has rolled out an ideology without deviation or constraint, making its pillars the law of the land, and has entirely lost control of his own creation. Our Prime Minister has touted Canada as one of the world's most progressive nations, quote, leading the way on a variety of social issues. Yet in reality, without the possession of foresight or the ability to demonstrate flexibility or nuance, he has lost control of the monster he has created on almost every major policy file. Allow me to highlight a few of the key policy areas in which our apprentice has hastily opened the floodgates, resulting in a complete loss of command for the government, often beyond recall. I'll start at the beginning with a promise that Trudeau made before even becoming the Prime Minister. That is that 2015 would be the last election under the first past-the-post system. This pledge was made more than 2,000 times on the campaign trail. He committed to engage in consultations and to strike up a representative committee to determine the best path forward. Quickly, however, it became very clear that the special committee, the town halls, and the nationwide consultations were nothing more than excessively costly smoke and mirrors. He knew that a referendum would not deliver the results he was looking for, so he opted for a cloaked rubber stamp instead. Immediately after taking office, the Trudeau government promised that regardless of how many consultations unfolded, they would be ending the voting system that had been in use in Canada since the beginning of our democracy. Additionally, the government's all-party committee on electoral reform was unsurprisingly stacked with Liberals. Furthermore, colleagues, the Green Party and the Bloc Québécois were not even given voting rights. Then the committee was given an implausibly short deadline of 6 months to produce a report with recommendations. For Trudeau, everything was falling into place, and his dream of changing the electoral system to ensure Liberal governments forever was quickly becoming a reality. The problem for the Prime Minister was that, while he was publicly stating that the government was wide open to reform options, he had in reality one specific electoral system in mind and was not open to any alternative. The Prime Minister wanted a ranked or preferential ballot method, a system that would disputably favor the Liberal Party. However, when none of the experts who testified at committee thought this was a wise idea, and when the committee subsequently recommended a national referendum, the Prime Minister was suddenly less passionate about upholding his campaign promise. In June of 2017, the Prime Minister announced that there was no path to bringing in electoral reform because none of the other parties wanted to accommodate the Liberal preference for ranked ballots. Justin Trudeau used the issue of electoral reform to get a majority. But when his plan to skew the system in favor of the Liberals failed, he cynically reneged on his promise. You would think that Trudeau would accept the fact that when changing the electoral system, a certain level of consensus must be achieved, and since there was no consensus, he did the graceful thing in retreating. Well, no, not Justin Trudeau. He said in a podcast just last week that he regretted not having used his majority in the House of Commons to ram his new system down the throats of Canadians. And he candidly said that he regretted not rigging the system in favor of the Liberals. Ironically, he also said one of the biggest reasons for him wanting to run one more time was that his 18-year-old son would be able to vote for him, not because of what he would do for our country. Electoral reform is not the only way Justin Trudeau wanted to tilt our democratic institutions in favor of the Liberal Party. The changes he made to the Senate were no doubt to make sure that his policies, even if rejected by a large majority of Canadians, will survive his impeding electoral route. While the desire to reform the Senate is as old as the institution itself, any changes that risk compromising the very purpose of the institution have always been handled with tremendous care and caution. In 2014, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that any attempt by one Prime Minister to fundamentally change the nature of the Senate without consulting the provinces would be unconstitutional. In the past, when there has been any doubt, Prime Ministers had the good sense to turn to the highest court to get clarity. However, not this Prime Minister. Care and caution are not his style. For the sake of political expediency, during what is now commonly referred to as the Senate expense scandal, Trudeau decided to distance himself from Liberal senators, at least in the public eye, and rebrand the new Liberal appointees as independents. He even gave them some new fun titles, which did nothing but cause uncertainty in our rules and a burdensome process to accommodate the new made-up terms. No matter what the government would like us to believe, these new senators were hand-picked by Justin Trudeau, not selected by some group. The 88 senators appointed since 2015 were chosen by Justin Trudeau personally. For 9 long years, we have been hearing the purportedly narrative that the Trudeau Senate is apparently more independent than before. Nothing, colleagues, is further from the truth. Last July, the CBC of all media outlets said that despite Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's promise to rid the Senate of partisan and patronage, most of the senators appointed to the upper house over the past years have ties to the Liberals.
Shocking.
Those so-called independent senators have donated money to the federal Liberals or have worked with the federal party or a provincial Liberal party. Last July, the Globe and Mail put it clearly.
Don't forget the NDP.
While it was always better for the health of the skeptical mind to put the words independent senator in quotation marks, when it came to political persuasions of Mr. Trudeau's 82 appointments since 2016, the tenor of his latest ones make it a medical necessity. And that was before the most recent appointments. Now, I want to make it clear, colleagues, I support political appointments to the Senate. This is not a shot at any one senator here. I support political appointments. To do this job efficiently, you need to understand how Canada and its political institutions work. You have to be able to access a network, including a caucus, that brings you knowledge and perspective. What I do not like is the hypocrisy of using the label independent when you have been appointed by an ultra-partisan Prime Minister who is the leader of the party you have worked for a long time. As I said, our new colleagues will join the dozens of senators appointed by Justin Trudeau who voted 96% of the time with the leader of the government in the Senate. Canadians have not bought into this facade of independence for Trudeau's Senate, but his experiment is more than a problem of smoke and mirrors. For one, it has led to substantial increase in costs. The Senate's actual costs in fiscal 2015-16 before Justin Trudeau appointed senators were under $75 million. The budget for the current year after 82 Trudeau appointments is $135 million. $60 million more for the Trudeau Senate. And that is a fact, colleagues, even if Senator Monsian would like to change the numbers. Those are facts. It has also led to a lack of efficiency in the chamber. What used to be negotiated between the government and the opposition now must involve several leaders, making it more difficult to reach consensus and maintain agreements. Even if the other leaders will inevitably follow the government lead. What has also happened with so many splintered groups and lack of caucus cohesion is a stark increase in senators rising to speak, not just me for unlimited time. Just to repeat what has already been said, a tiresome burden on productivity. Senators who have always exercised independence used to also have the support of a working relationship with their respective national caucus. The discussion surrounding the drafting of legislation used to be hammered out in caucus meetings, where senators could weigh in on, for example, the regional impacts of a specific proposal. Good case in point is Senator Prosper just speaking about C-49. That had been left up to 2 caucuses. I think we would have come across the finish line in a much better manner than we did now. Now, when senators are looking for a legislative proposal for the first time, and each senator has a very specific pet concern, the process gets bogged down and delayed. How many private members' bills do we have in the Senate right now? And you can add to this mess the fact that we have a record number of Senate public bills in front of us, which means committees no longer have the time to conduct studies. Like all institutions that have existed for more than a century, the Senate has never been immune to the need for regular reviews of rules and processes. Yet what was once an efficient institution of thoughtful review has now become a vessel for endless personal projects advanced through Senate public bills. What began as a hasty PR experiment for Trudeau has resulted in a radical shifting of an institution with less productivity, less transparency, and less value for the taxpayers. Again, as the Globe and Mail itself concluded last July, on top of being more expensive, but no less partisan than it was before, the Senate is also now less productive. It is now clear that the attempt to change the Senate is a failed experiment by our woke sorcerer's apprentice. On cannabis, Justin Trudeau approached the legalization of cannabis in the same manner, a mix of progressive ideology, political calculation, and a desire to make his Liberal friends profit. It was a sure winner, or so he thought. As journalist Susan Martinuk reported, he no doubt felt it would be one of his easiest and most rewarding tasks as Canada's new and uber-cool Prime Minister.
Terrible.
However, when problems with Bill C-45 were revealed, Trudeau persisted anyway. As Martinuk pointed out, and I quote, Trudeau's determination to push the bill through clearly exposes the problem with Bill C-45. It's a watershed moment that covers public policy, healthcare, and Canadian law. Yet, the Liberals refuse to see it as anything more than an election promise that must be in place by August. Details be damned. End of quote. As Trudeau tends to do when facts get in the way of his ideology, he ignores the experts. He ignored the police, who said they were not ready. He ignored the medical experts, who said the legislation posed an increased risk for children. He ignored the experts who testified from Colorado and Washington and offered a strong warning to slow down. Don't rush the process. Right. Take your time. Even when the public is clamoring for access, he ignored the law professors who warned that the black market does not go away after legalization. And he ignored the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, who said the illegal production of marijuana increased 20-fold in U.S. jurisdictions with legalization.
Shame.
Wow.
It's now been more than 6 years since cannabis was legalized. The promises, as many of us in this chamber remember, were that the new policy would, A, improve safety and public health and reduce access to youth, B, lessen drug-related crime and diminish or even kill the illegal market, and C, create a new profitable and legal industry. The first promise about health and safety for our youth has not been kept. For the 5th anniversary of the passage of Bill C-45, the Canadian Medical Association Journal undertook a wide study, one of the largest of its kind, and subsequently reported many disturbing findings. First, the report notes an increase in the prevalence of cannabis use. This is confirmed by Statistics Canada. 14.8% of Canadians consumed cannabis before legalization in 2017, and the number stabilized at 22% in 2021. This means that there are roughly 50% more people using cannabis than there was before legalization.
Terrible.
And it is not only the increase in the number of users that is concerning, it is the severity of the results of this increased consumption. The CMJA study showed that there has been a sharp increase in cannabis-related emergency department visits and in cannabis-impaired driving since legalization. The study also found that people who visit emergency departments for cannabis use are at a heightened risk of being diagnosed with schizophrenia. At the same time, Ottawa mental health specialists say they are seeing a striking increase in patients presenting with significant psychiatric issues that appear to be related to cannabis use, a trend seen widely across the province. The report notes that across Ontario, annual increases of cannabis-induced psychosis increased by 220.7% between 2014 and 2021. As predicted by those of us who warned the government, this was a large uptick in cannabis poisonings among young children in provinces where edibles were legal. The increase in the availability also led to a surge in cannabis-attributable hospitalizations, particularly among people aged 25 years and older. We have now reached the point that, according to StatsCan, and I quote, many Canadians are consuming cannabis before or at work, raising questions about safety on the job. StatsCan also reported that 1 in 20 Canadians, approximately 300,000 people, who had consumed cannabis in the previous second year scored high enough on the severity of dependence scale to be considered a risk for addiction.
That explains Trudeau cabinet.
Thank you. I would agree with that. I would agree with that. They probably, well, I probably can't say that. I might have to retract that. The outcomes we are seeing are the precise outcomes the Prime Minister was warned about. Yet he did not have the wisdom or foresight to pause or pivot from his ideological tenet he held so dear. According to a recent CBC article, and again, this is the CBC, and I quote, they say 5 years later, public health experts say legalization hasn't created any health benefits, but has been linked to some serious concerns. The second promise, the reduction of the role of organized crime in the cannabis market, has also not been kept. The black market now accounts for 35% of sales, according to Stats Canada, and faces virtually no risk from enforcement. A study by Deloitte suggested that the average price in the illicit market remains 20% lower than in the legal retail stores. As for the business side of the cannabis legal trade, it has also been a colossal failure. Too many companies entered the market, and the government failed to put in place a realistic tax scheme. Paul McCarthy, the president of Cannabis Council of Canada, quoted last July in the Globe and Mail, said, 40% of all filings from companies seeking protection from creditors to restructure last year came from the cannabis sector, 40%. The regulatory and taxation regime is suffocating this business, he said. For many Liberal insiders, though, this does not matter. They were the first to invest in the sector, sometimes way before the bill was tabled. They knew it was coming. Once Bill C-45 passed and cannabis became the new stock craze, they unloaded their shares before the valuation of the cannabis producers went tumbling down. Instead of treading carefully, Justin Trudeau wanted his Canada to be the first country to legalize pot. He would then look across the globe like this cool dude that he thinks he is. All he managed to do is create more problems. This is another Trudeau failed experiment. Now turning to dangerous drugs. The Trudeau government used the same far-left ideological approach vis-a-vis more dangerous drugs. In 2023, 8,049 people died of opioid overdoses in Canada. Over 2,500 of them were in the province of British Columbia. Under Justin Trudeau, crime, hopelessness, and despair have reached unprecedented levels. This is fertile ground for increased drug use, and this is exactly what we see. There have been, colleagues, 45,000 deaths related to the opioid toxicity crisis in Canada since Justin Trudeau became the Prime Minister. The number of deaths has increased on a yearly basis by 184% since our woke sorcerer's apprentice became the Prime Minister of Canada. This year, the equivalent of half the population of my city of Steinbach, half the population will die of opioid overdose in Canada. This is a national tragedy, and we are not talking about the ravages caused by other hard drugs. What has been Justin Trudeau's answer? First, he decided to make it easier for drug dealers to get bail and make sure there would be no longer any harsh sentences, but I will come to that later. Then the government embarked on a program to basically provide the drugs to users. Instead of treating the addiction, the Liberals decided it would be good to fuel the addiction. Saves on assisted suicide, I guess. This program has been a failure. Not only does it reduce the number of people that were addicted, but it even increases it. Earlier this year, police conducted massive busts of diverted drugs in Prince George and Campbell River. The Vancouver Police Department have stated that around 50% of all hydromorphone seizures were diverted from Trudeau's taxpayer-funded hard drugs program. According to the president of London Police Association, it is common knowledge among police officers that so-called safe supply programs are being abused and widely diverted into the community so that users can use profits from their sales to buy even more deadly fentanyl. The hard drugs that the Trudeau government provides are frequently resold to teenagers and other vulnerable Canadians, getting them hooked on opioids and leading them into the destructive cycle of addiction. Not only are those government-funded drug dens distributing drugs that are resold on the street, but they are also often in residential areas, close to schools or kindergartens. For the Trudeau Liberals, there is no issue in having syringes in playgrounds or having the kindergartens ask police to go with toddlers for their safety during their daily strolls. The other wacko policy that the wacko Liberals put in place is the decriminalization of hard drugs. In British Columbia, where Trudeau, the sorcerer's apprentice, began his experiment, the province saw a 400% increase in drug overdose deaths. Drug overdoses have become the leading cause of death for children in BC between the ages of 10 and 18. Heartbreaking, colleagues, heartbreaking. This experiment also led to rampant open drug use in playgrounds, public spaces, and even hospitals. That is why even the NDP Premier of British Columbia had to ask the government to walk back this dangerous failed experiment. If you don't believe me that the Trudeau plan is just a failed experiment, just turn to our former colleague Larry Campbell. Who can be accused of a lot of things, but being a conservative, colleagues, is not one of them. Senator Campbell was a huge supporter of the Trudeau approach to illegal drugs. Last July, he said that the government made a mistake when it decriminalized the possession of small amounts of illicit drugs without thinking through the impact on communities. He said the government made an even worse mistake when it started dispensing prescription opioids to drug users. According to Senator Campbell, the government has put too much stress on reducing the harms that come with using drugs and not enough on helping people quit using them altogether. Not often that I agreed with Senator Larry Campbell, but I do here. This has been a failed experiment. Now, Justin Trudeau's tenure as Prime Minister has been marked by COVID. Such a pandemic had not been seen for a century. So obviously there was a lot of improvisation and experiments by governments here and all over the globe. Let me summarize how Justin Trudeau's government fared in this. First, we can all deplore the fact that none of the lessons that should have been learned from smaller pandemics, such as SARS or the avian flu, seem to have been remembered by the federal government. It was as if we were caught completely flat-footed, with no material ready and no plan. I find that strange, since it was made clear by the previous Conservative government. We had a minister here who wanted to remember the previous Conservative government. They had plans that were drawn up, and we had sufficient stocks of PPE. It is obvious that the Liberal government failed to maintain our strategic PPE stocks and to adequately prepare for a pandemic that almost all experts predicted would come sooner or later. So, left unprepared, how did Justin Trudeau and company react? First, they denied there was a problem. They believed every lie that the Chinese Communist Party and the World Health Organization spewed until it became obvious that they were indeed lies. Even if our security agencies and our allies warned the Trudeau government that this dangerous disease was spreading rapidly, it did not treat the threat seriously. The Liberals refused to stop flights from China until it was too late, accusing those of us who proposed to act of being racist. The Liberals dithered before starting to stock PPE and medication, putting us at the back of the line for purchases. When the Conservatives raised the issue in the House of Commons on January 27, 2020, the Minister of Health said, and I quote, that the risk to Canadians remains low. That the risk to Canadians remains low. The Liberals didn't do anything until it was too late. Then in March of 2020, the government realized that COVID was indeed a serious threat. At first, the Liberals just improvised. They really had no clue what they were doing. Our health experts told us to wash our groceries, but that wearing a mask would be useless, since we were all too dumb to know how to wear it. The Liberals panicked and did what Liberals do when there is a problem: throw money at the problem, while of course allowing fellow Liberals to get rich. They bought millions and millions of dollars of equipment, always at inflated prices, and most of the time for nothing. They signed contracts with friends of the Liberal Party, such as former Liberal MP Frank Baylis, who sold ventilators, colleagues, that were never used. In fact, the government spent over $750 million on ventilators, 95% of which were never used. $750 million. SNC-Lavalin was awarded a $150 million contract for field hospitals that were never requested by the Department of Health. No province asked for the supplies. On top of the equipment and supplies that were never used, there were some that were not even delivered. The government itself admitted that it had paid more than $100 million for supplies that were never, ever delivered. Because we do not have a truthful accounting of all the expenses, we can assume that this number is much higher than that.
Without a doubt.
At the same time, the Liberal government decided to close the border, something it deemed racist just a few weeks before. They forced people to quarantine in disgusting conditions, all based on wrong information from arrived, canned, and unproven tests. Speaking of tests, Trudeau's Canada was among the last of the countries to understand that testing was a key and to buy those tests. We waited weeks and weeks before getting what other countries had. In February, Global News revealed that, and I quote, "The Canadian government awarded 2 of the largest medical supply contracts of the pandemic to importers participating in an invitation-only federal program, rather than to Canadian manufacturers offering lower prices." It also revealed that the contracts were awarded despite the government being given incomplete data about the product's accuracy. The Liberals foolishly funded development of a vaccine. The CanSino, in collaboration with, of all places, China. The vaccine was never delivered. They gave hundreds of millions of dollars to Liberal insiders to develop a vaccine at Medicago that they knew could never be approved since the company was connected to a tobacco manufacturer. They gave $130 million to Biologics Manufacturing Center to build a vaccine plant. Do you know how many doses have been manufactured? Zero. Zero.
Wow.
The Liberals had to turn to foreign companies to provide vaccines. They did so late, so we were behind other countries. And the Liberals bought such massive numbers of vaccines that the Auditor General estimated that at least 50 million doses had to be wasted. 50 million doses. How much did we waste? We will never know because the government is refusing to tell us. Because we overbought and overpaid, Canada was considered as the worst global hoarder of vaccine doses, frustrating poorer countries. Once they had the vaccines, the Liberals decided that they would, now they had the vaccines, they would force people to get vaccinated. They forced vaccine mandates to people for whom it never made sense, such as public servants working from home, or truck drivers working alone in their trucks, people with medical conditions that were warned by their doctors not to take them. They pushed vaccines many times to the detriment of those who were vaccinated. Transport Canada called its own vaccine mandate aggressive and unique in the world. Courts have now found the mandates unconstitutional. Finally, to top it all off, Justin Trudeau decided that he needed the Emergency Act to put an end to the occupation of 4 or 5 city blocks in Ottawa by truckers who look so dangerous in their hot tubs on Wellington Street. Canada was universally mocked, and Justin Trudeau looked like the arrogant, petulant brat that he is. COVID was an excuse for the Liberals to enrich their friends. I will not get into all the details of the contracts awarded at the time.
Too many.
But the names We Charity and Arrive scam have become synonymous with Liberal corruption. And did the government deliver in fighting COVID? Let me summarize by reading some headlines. Canada's nursing homes have the worst record for COVID-19 deaths among wealthy nations. Again, CBC. Canada doing one of the worst jobs in the world in fighting COVID. Radical lockdowns had extraordinary costs. Last year, the British Medical Journal said that when COVID struck, Canada was an ill-prepared country with outdated data systems, poor coordination, and cohesion and blindness about its citizens' diverse needs. It was Canadians themselves who should be commended for winning over COVID. As the journal concluded, Canadians delivered on the pandemic response while its government faltered. I could go on for several more minutes and go into details about the mismanagement of the COVID crisis by the Liberals.
Go on for weeks.
I probably could. As usual, with the Liberals, you have a mix of incompetence, arrogance, and corruption that make them take bad decision after bad decision. I profoundly regret that there was never a true inquiry or audit on what the government did, if it worked or not, and how we can do better next time. Because, colleagues, we have to do better next time. We have to learn those lessons from all of those Liberal sorcerers' apprentice mistakes. If the government made sure that there would never be such an inquiry, it is because they know they failed and that they would learn too much, we would learn too much about their incompetence and their corruption. The Trudeau Liberals failed on how to deal with the health repercussions of COVID. They also failed on dealing with the economic repercussions. When COVID struck, much of the world had to determine what financial measure would be put into place to address a global health crisis we did not yet understand. Governments were forced to allocate tax dollars to support measures to protect the livelihoods of their citizens and their overall economy. With so much uncertainty at the helm, most countries proceeded in a restrained, cautious, and targeted manner. But not our Prime Minister, our very own sorcerer's apprentice. Our government spending during the pandemic, while initially described by some as generous, quickly spiraled out of control. The data for this and the warnings from experts and financial institutions were present from the beginning. In November of 2020, the CIBC warned Trudeau that the majority of his emergency support handouts were being spent on imported consumer goods, and therefore leaking out of the economy to other nations. The economist who penned the report noted that the leakage could easily be fixed by focusing on programs that encourage consumers to spend on local services. He also warned that if nothing is done, Canada would have to spend even more on fiscal support. After all, Canada had already outspent all of the G20 nations on our pandemic response. And as the CIBC report notes, this resulted in no additional benefit to employment or the GDP. This advice was ignored. On March of 2021, StatsCan reported that Canadians experienced extraordinary positive changes in their economic well-being during the pandemic as they gained thousands of dollars more from COVID-19 support payments than they lost in wages. They reported, in fact, that COVID-19 benefits outpaced earning losses across all 5 income classes studied by StatsCan. An economist at Scotiabank noted it underscores in a rough sense what the federal government did, which was go big and go quick and overshoot. Several economists and institutions warned the government that they needed to scale back their benefit programs, most notably the CERB program, stating that it was too generous and could be acting as a disincentive for people to return work. These too were ignored. In February of 2021, the Conference Board of Canada warned of the inescapable ramifications of record-high debts amassed during the pandemic, stating, "The lasting impact on revenues and expenditures suggests that the governments in Canada will struggle over the near and longer terms to dig themselves out of this gigantic fiscal hole." Also in February of 2021, the International Monetary Fund said that Trudeau lacked justification for his sizable spending plans and that any additional unnecessary expenditures would weaken the credibility of the fiscal framework. On the same week, a report from C.D. Howe Institute raised major concerns about Trudeau's promised $100 billion in stimulus funds, saying that it remained unconvinced that a large stimulus package is appropriate at this time. Despite the warnings, our apprentice carried on and the flooding began. In fact, by early March of 2021, the Trudeau government had already blown past the $6.3 billion estimate they declared that it would cost to run the Canada Recovery Benefit, had already nearly doubled the program spending to $11.1 billion. Lest one be convinced that these warnings from experts and major banks did not make it across the Prime Minister's desk, please keep in mind, colleagues, that Justin Trudeau's very own Finance Minister, Bill Morneau, who was tasked with the fiscal management of the country and the rollout of these programs, left one of the highest political offices in the country because Trudeau's spending had gotten so out of control. In his book, Where to From Here? A Path to Canadian Prosperity, Morneau wrote that he and Trudeau came to loggerheads on the matter of COVID spending. He noted that during the pandemic, calculations and recommendations from the Ministry of Finance were disregarded in favor of, quote, winning a popularity contest. Let me repeat that, winning a popularity contest. And that his role as finance minister, and again I quote, had deteriorated into serving as something between a figurehead and a rubber stamp. That's our Prime Minister, arts instructor, snowboard instructor, telling an educated finance minister. Yet the Fraser Institute pointed out that in 2021, federal per-person debt reached a new record of $48,955. But COVID, once again, cannot be blamed for all of this debt accumulation. Without any COVID-related spending in 2021, federal per-person debt would still have reached $41,340. In 2021, the fourth highest amount in Canadian history. The authors conclude, clearly federal debt was already on an upward trajectory and the pandemic only exacerbated the problem. As it turns out, every economic expert and financial institution that warned of the disaster was correct. A devastating inflation appeared across Canada and for all products and services. Canadians are still feeling the consequences. The former governor of the Bank of Canada, Stephen Plett, said that the Trudeau government used a fire hose approach and that a firefighter never gets criticized for using too much water. I beg to differ. The reckless policies of the Trudeau government, in fact, flooded the Canadian economy with too much easy money. They created the inflation. They created the inflation. As Trudeau was warned, our floors were awash with water. And Trudeau continued to use the fire hose long after the fire was put out. The new governor of the Bank of Canada, Tim Macklem, confirmed that the government spending has gotten in the way of bringing down inflation. As with inflation remaining high, the bank had no other option than to raise interest rates with devastating effects on businesses and homeowners. In March of 2023, the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada confirmed that it had to go through the COVID crisis again. If it had to go through the COVID crisis again, the bank would not use the same strategy. This reckless spending was motivated by the Liberals' far-left thinking that every problem can be solved by more government spending. As I said, for the Liberals, these radical experiments are always done with an eye on the political benefits. Justin Trudeau thought he could surf on this wave of massive COVID spending and called an early election in 2021. He thought he could buy Canadians with their own money. And as always with the Trudeau government, the negative effects of radical policies combined with political cynicism are compounded by the incompetence of this government. The programs were too generous, but more than this, it became an open bar. Last May, the Canadian Revenue Agency confirmed it had identified so far $10 billion of COVID payments to individuals who were ineligible under the government programs. Hundreds of public servants have already been fired for misappropriation of funds. This is in addition to the more than $15 billion identified by the AG for another program. And this was only after scratching the surface. Investigators in random checks uncovered problems with almost 2/3 of the claims under the $100.6 billion Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. As Auditor General Karen Hogan said, Auditor General Karen Hogan, the rate was so high it requires you to really look more, said Hogan. You would think that the government would aggressively try to recover these massive payments. Well, you would be wrong. That would be bad politics, wouldn't it? So the head of the Canadian Revenue Agency said it was not worth the effort. The PBO said that such an attitude is disconcerting. This, colleagues, is an understatement. So not content with having doubled the debt and created inflation, our sorcerer's apprentice carries on with his experiments. And this will be my last one that I will speak about tonight, colleagues. But trust me, there will be more to come, Senator Pate. There will be more to come.
There's a lot to highlight with this.
One of the darker and most glaring, obvious examples of the sorcerer's apprentice is Canada's out-of-control assisted suicide regime. As is often the case with slippery slopes, it begins with a denial and mockery of its existence. In the case of assisted suicide, the denial of the slippery slope was loud and strong, both from the Trudeau government and the Supreme Court. Yet it did not take long for the proverbial slope to come into view. If you consider where we began, with the initial legalization of assisted suicide, and look to where we are now, less than 10 years later, it is nothing short of shocking. There were warnings from concerned experts in other jurisdictions that had gone this route and were currently living with the consequences. In the Carter case, there was evidence presented by a medical expert from Belgium that a slippery slope was very possible, specifically that by opening the assisted suicide floodgates, even in a narrow scheme in which terminally ill people are offered help in ending their lives, we would be opening the door to a system in which vulnerable groups like the disabled are offered death before they are offered adequate care. The court rejected this, stating that the permissive regime in Belgium is a product of a very different medico-legal culture. This assertion was adopted and repeated by the Trudeau government, who stated that we would avoid this expansion of eligibility by setting up a carefully regulated scheme that would keep its application, quote, narrow and exceptional. Narrow and exceptional, colleagues. The number of Canadians ending their lives through assisted suicide has grown at a speed that outpaces every country in the world. We are quickly, very quickly, becoming the world's assisted suicide capital. Our most appalling reported cases are even getting international attention. In just 6 years, the number of deaths from assisted suicide increased 13-fold. From 1,018 deaths in 2016, let me repeat that, 1,018 deaths, to over 13,200 in 2022.
Shocking.
Shocking, shocking. More Canadians die by euthanasia than from liver disease, Alzheimer's, diabetes, or pneumonia. In fact, assisted suicide is now effectively tied as the 5th leading cause of death in our country. However, the numbers from the government do not reflect that. Why? When completing the medical certificate of death, physicians are required to list the illness, disease, or disability leading to the assisted suicide request as the cause of death, rather than the medications administered, the actual cause. This is a strange and suspicious manipulation of the data. as Barbara Kay asked, if MAID is a public good, why the deflection? If the astronomical numbers are not enough to convince you that the government has lost control, perhaps some of the circumstances will. A 54-year-old woman living in Vancouver is one of more than 1.4 million Canadians with disabilities who live in poverty. That, colleagues, is 40% of the population. Because of the lack of adequate services to support her and her condition, she has relied on credit card to cover expenses and has amassed $40,000 in debt. Because of a lack of research on her condition, the treatments she is seeking are considered experimental and therefore not covered by our healthcare system. However, what is available to her, she discovered, is assisted suicide. After the expansion of our assisted suicide policies through C7, which enabled access to those for whom death is not reasonably foreseeable, she applied and was approved for assisted suicide. Her friend started a GoFundMe page in a desperate attempt to keep her around for longer. But they admit they do not know if it will be enough. She reported that assisted suicide will likely be her only option. A 54-year-old St. Catharines, Ontario man named Amir Farsod applied for assisted suicide, not because he wants to die, but because his social supports are failing him, and he fears he may have no other choice. He told reporters, "I don't want to die, but I don't want to be homeless more than I don't want to die." Another disturbing case involved Christine Gauthier, retired corporal and Paralympian, who had been seeking help for over 5 years to get a wheelchair ramp installed. In an interview with CTV, Gauthier shared her disbelief when the government could not accommodate her request. But instead, our government colleagues offered her assisted death. This is our government. She said in a heartbreaking quote, "You're going to help me to die, but you don't want to help me to live." This is our government. We have all heard of a number of cases of veterans being offered assisted suicide to ease their mental and physical suffering. This is a group that we are collectively, every one of us in this chamber and in our country, are indebted to, who should be able to depend on a steady network to help ease their transition back into civilian life. Yet workers under the system are suggesting to them that their lives are not worth living. This past summer, a 31-year-old woman, Catherine Mentler, went to Vancouver General Hospital in the midst of a mental health crisis. At the height of her suicidal vulnerability, a clinician offered her that there are long waits to see a psychiatrist and remarked that our healthcare system is broken, and then asked her, "Have you considered MAID?" Healthcare professional. A vulnerable suicidal patient asking for help to live, and instead is offered a way to die. That, colleagues, is the kind of case that is at risk of becoming a norm in our country if the next phase of this slippery slope comes to fruition. That is the proposed expansion of assisted suicide eligibility to include those whose sole underlying condition is a mental disorder. The policy that is so far beyond what our society or our system is ready for or even willing to accept that the government initially enacted a sunset clause and has subsequently delayed it twice. The repeated delays have resulted in a lot of opportunity for debate and for raising the myriad of moral and ethical concerns of offering death to mentally ill and suicidal patients. The Trudeau government and some of their Senate appointees have repeatedly tried to draw a distinction between assisted suicide requests and suicidality. Former Minister, Justice Minister David Lametti, when he was asked by journalist Althea Raj about ensuring our system actually offers people ethical choices, replied, and I quote, "Remember that suicide generally is available to people. This is a group within the population who, for physical reasons and possibly mental reasons, can't make that choice to do it themselves. And ultimately, this provides a more humane way for them to make a decision they otherwise could have made if they were able in some other way, unquote." Colleagues, the best thing about David Lametti is that he has resigned from the Trudeau cabinet. There is the admission as clear as day. The Trudeau government sees no problem with speeding up access to what they call humane form of suicide to depressed and suicidal patients. A humane form of suicide. As Althea Raj pondered, is the government not in the business of suicide prevention? Should we not be trying to give people a reason to live? You will have noticed, colleagues, that I do not use the term MAID to describe what is at its core assisted suicide. For me, the use of the cold acronym of MAID is part of the effort by some to detach it from reality, to create a different concept that is not palatable. The trajectory that the Trudeau government is following reinforces the need to be clear, very clear about what we are talking about. Dr. Sono Gain, the highly esteemed former president of the Canadian Psychiatric Association, told the Special Joint Parliamentary Committee, "The expansion is not so much a slippery slope as a runaway train. The government has had plenty of signs. We should not be proceeding. You can choose to go ahead, but you can't pretend that you weren't warned." The public outcry on the outrageous reported case have been profound, and in reality is the real reason the government has not moved forward with the expansion to date. How has the government responded to this growing public concern? By improving access to mental health care, housing affordability, or service for veterans? Of course not. In fact, in each of these measures, our system has gotten worse. People are feeling broken. There has been a substantial increase in depression and generalized anxiety disorders. Access to mental health care remains abysmal, yet we have a government who is remaining steadfast in their support of opening up the door to state-sponsored suicide for Canadians with mental illness. The proponents know they have gone way too far. The Canadian public does not want this. The provinces and territories are not ready for this, and medical practitioners are not ready for this. Yet, the Trudeau government is not willing to reverse it. They have made it clear that by expanding access to assisted suicide to those suffering from mental illness is not a matter of if, but of when. As Senator Kuchar, the original mover of this expansion amendment, has stated, the issue is decided. When it comes to policy, I cannot imagine a more fitting reflection of the sorcerer's apprentice metaphor than the trajectory of Canada's assisted suicide regime. From opening the door under the guise of the promise of a narrow and exceptional application to becoming the assisted suicide capital of the world, to now finding ourselves beholden to a future policy so vile that even its top proponents must continue to delay its enactment, not consider, but simply put off. Colleagues, I know you will be happy with this statement. This concludes the first part of my analysis of the failed experiments of Justin Trudeau. I invite all colleagues to stay tuned for the rest, but in the meantime, I will adjourn the debate for the balance of my time.